My name is Michael Kohlecker, and I will do the second presentation in this plenary session. And the title of this second presentation is "Did Video Kill the Lecture Hall Stars?" And as you might have already imagined, this is borrowed from the 1978 song "Did Video Kill the Radio Star?" That's why it's always a little bit tricky to give this title to someone else, because I tend to tell you the wrong title from time to time. But what I'm going to do with you now is I want to do a little analysis, and it's actually a preliminary empirical work. I'm going to do a little analysis of the role of technology during this COVID-19 pandemic. And we're looking into some empirical data on this, and we try to draw out our lessons learned from this first half year of crisis management using technology in virtual classrooms, and so on. Now, let us begin with a brief look into the pandemic. I don't want to be too detailed here, but I'd like to capture the most important milestones, especially when it comes to how we in Austria experienced the COVID-19 pandemic, because this gives you an idea of what I'm talking about and what the situation here in Kufstein and in other regions in Austria has been in spring, in summer, and now in fall, as we're currently recording this video. Now, as you all know, COVID-19 started somewhere at the shifts between 2019 and 2020, and the World Health Organization has already declared it a health crisis, or general health crisis, by the end of January. This was by this time an outbreak limited to the province of Hubei in China. But a couple of months later, it arrived in Europe and the rest of the world. And this is why the World Health Organization in March 2020 declared COVID-19 a global health crisis, a pandemic, as we know today. What you can see here is the epidemic curve in Austria. So you can see there is a little peak compared to the large peak that we're seeing at the very end of the timeline in March. And this was actually shortly before that we had the first COVID-19 patients, or official COVID-19 cases in Austria, in Tyrol, actually. And from there, things got viral. In March 2020, on the 16th of March 2020, the Austrian government was forced to do a hard lockdown, which affected nearly all the life in Austria, as in the private sector. Also, universities, of course, were affected, and from there on, we could not do any presence lectures in our lecture halls anymore. We had to shift to virtual classrooms, to distance learning completely. And we remained in this state until the end of the summer term. So by the end of July, we still completed the final exams in distance learning. And we started to plan the winter term in August with the agenda to have a hybrid mode. Which would be students would be in Kufstein one week and would learn from home the other week in an alternating fashion. And as you can see, the numbers in Austria rose and rose. By the end of October, it was pretty clear that we're heading into another lockdown, and this is where we're currently in. So for us in Kufstein, it was a hard shift from classical teaching to virtual teaching. We implemented a lot of virtual classrooms to keep the teaching somehow going, and we learned a lot. And the talk that I'm going to make here is about these lessons learned that we had as part of the pandemic. So from one day to the other, we found ourselves in a lot of different virtual classrooms. This is just a screenshot from one of my virtual classrooms a couple of weeks ago, but it didn't look very different in spring at the beginning of the lockdown. Here you can see me in my TIE Fighter cockpit. This is how I'd like to present to my students, but yeah, but that's how we did it actually. A lot of us teaching personnel switched to this kind of format, virtual classroom, to keep on the teaching that we otherwise wouldn't have been able to do. Okay, now what the central part of this talk will be is, of course, the role of technology. And as you have already seen, the virtual classroom was an important part of this, and therefore I'd like to focus on the virtual classroom as kind of a technology, at least as a tool in this context, and I'd like to give my analysis for this very specific tool. But before I do this, I'd like to shed a brief light on the concept of technology, which is an important one, and I've given you two definitions for technology on this slide. The first definition is a rather old one. You can see it in the side notes on the bottom of the slide. This is from 1823. It says technology comes from art or discourse and is a description of arts, especially those which are mechanical. So in the first place, it was, of course, about mechanical arts because there were no digital technologies at that time. Today, we frame the concept a little bit more different. The second definition that I have here is from the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and I just looked it up a couple of days ago. And it is technology is the practical application of knowledge, especially in a particular area. This is where, for example, education technology would be located at. Now, if you look at these two definitions of technology, you can see that they're both somehow awkward. They're a little bit abstract, and they do not really reflect what I, as a teacher, for example, perceive when I look at the bunch of technology that I'm working with today. What you see here in the background is my home office. This is my personal studio that I'm working from. And you see on my desk is a myriad of different technologies just lying around. This is at least what I perceive it to be. But the definition of technology that I gave you just the slide before is so different that you might ask, now, why is this definition so far away from what I experience as technology and what I use in my daily work regularly on a day-to-day basis? Now, well, let me just go back one slide. The reason for this is that there is so many ways of framing technology that it's really difficult for us to pick one way and say, well, this is the definition for technology. What I use in this talk is the sociomateriality lens. This is a theoretical background from information systems, and I just use it to shed a specific light onto this technology concept that I'm going to use to get my empirical findings from. And what social materiality says, in a nutshell, I bet there would be a whole talk about this possible, but this is just in a nutshell. What we see is when we look at a piece of technology, let's, for example, take my smartphone here. You could ask yourself, what makes my smartphone a smartphone? Well, actually, this is not a smartphone. It's a piece of material. It's glass, it's fabric, it's plastic, it's rubber, and of course, a little bit of metal is also inside of this husk. But why is it called smartphone? Well, it is because I, as a person, have some human agency, goals, ideas, things that I'd like to pursue with the help of a certain tool, like a smartphone, that is on one end, and on the other end, you have the material itself, and only the two together, the human agency and the material agency, form the technology that is behind this smartphone. That's what makes the smartphone smart. And in a sense, to me, my smartphone is maybe something different than what your smartphone is to you. And for me, it's maybe an extension to my brain, or it's a communication device or whatever. So there is a lot of human agency that lies in this definition, and that's what makes it difficult to give an abstract and general definition of technology. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to present 3 cases that I'm going to use to shed a light on the role of technology during the COVID-19 pandemic. And those 3 cases are personas. Those are not real persons, but they are somehow aggregates of different talks, interviews, and other data collections that I made during this pandemic to understand what's happening here. Ruth is the first one. She is a persona, not a real person. She's a director of studies. So she's responsible for managing a study program. And I give you her motto because the motto very much gives you everything that's important about Ruth in a nutshell. And her motto is, COVID is temporary, and we need to make the best out of it. And of course, we need to leave it behind as soon as possible. So as soon as possible, we go back to normal and everything is fine. The other persona is Frank. Frank is a senior lecturer, and he's been experimenting with all kinds of teaching styles, technology already. And his motto is a little bit different because he sees COVID-19 as an opportunity to develop himself further. And of course, his major task is teaching and supervising. But what he really likes to do is experimenting, trying out new things, getting more effective in his teaching. And then there's Samantha. She's a part-time student in a master's program. Yeah, for her, distance learning is kind of a relief. She likes it because it saves her a lot of traveling time, gives her more time for her job and her family. But she needs to bring these 3 things somehow together to be effective, efficient. Yeah. So let us look at how the shift to distance learning affected Ruth with her persona. And what we have here, just above my shoulder, is the starting change in routines, which was the lockdown. Our routines changed massively due to the lockdown. And coming from that, we see that Ruth's first human agency is actually, she definitely wants to keep her study program running. That's her first and most important endeavor that she's after. And technology, here, this is a change in technology. Technology helps her to do so. Because by implementing, for example, virtual classrooms, and this is where I limit myself to virtual classrooms, by implementing virtual classrooms in her study program, she can keep up the thing that she was doing before the pandemic, which is running an effective program in an efficient way. So for her, in the first place, the virtual classroom means the material agency that comes out of that is actually the virtual classroom is some sort of relief that helps to go further. And of course, this is all burdened by the constraint that if students cannot come to the lecture hall, you cannot run your program. So technology is somehow a relief to that constraint. And this is the first, what I call an imprecation, or not what I call an imprecation, but what sociomateriality theory calls an imprecation. That's a concept coined by Leonardi. What you see here is you see a human and a material agency coming together, forming a figuration of technology as a relief to this person. Now, coming out of this, we see other changes in routines, namely, as soon as Ruth has adopted virtual classrooms in her program, students got to like this kind of teaching, and so it was somehow incorporated in the regular program procedures, and it was somehow an affordance that technology could make for her. And out of this, we see the next implication coming out, which is, of course, if it is if it gets part of the regular program, then it has to meet all the quality criteria, for example, that are applied in this study program. And therefore, we need to take the next steps to make this happen. And here also, it's what's down here, the virtual classroom itself can be a tool that is helpful with this by, for example, improving the setup, creating a studio, creating quality criteria for lectures, and so on. You can leverage the teaching in a program. And of course, the constraint here is that if I use technology poorly, I will get poor results, and this will give us, for example, bad evaluations in the study program. And this is how the story goes. This is a complete implication chain for Ruth, and we can probably understand it because we understand her motives, her motto, that she's looking, or which she looks onto the whole crisis situation. For Frank, the thing looks very similar in the first part of this implication chain. So in the first place, okay, he implemented virtual classrooms in his classes. He could keep on teaching. But from there, things get a little bit more different, because in his daily life, the change in routine is a little bit different than the change in routine for Ruth. And he sees definitely the benefits that virtual classroom tools can give to his teaching. Remember, he's keen on improving himself. So he sees an affordance that technology can offer here, and he responds to this by creating, or by responding with a human agency that tries to improve, for example, his own personal teaching style, using technology, expanding his digital toolbox to leverage his own teaching. And the limitation here is, of course, that the first shot tools that he worked with were probably not the ones he wanted to work with. And now, in the long term, he tries to dig deeper, to go further, and improve his teaching. And with Samantha, we can see a similar chain starting at the lockdown and the material agency of a digital virtual classroom being a relief in the first place. But to her, things worked out a little bit different. The major change in routines to her was that the lines between job, family, and her studies got a little bit blurry. And therefore, she could not easily separate these three tasks in her personal life as a result to the shifting to distance learning, because normally she would have traveled to university, and just by traveling to university, she would have crossed the border between, for example, her personal life and her student life. Now that she doesn't need to travel, things are completely different to her, and that's where the borders between her different realities or personalities get blurred. How does she react? Well, of course, she can also see affordances that technology can offer. Maybe, for example, the recording of lectures that can be made when lectures are given in virtual classrooms can help to separate these realities again, just by, for example, doing the recording now and watching it later whenever there's time to watch the recording. So this is how technology can help her out in this situation. So her major agency in this case is she wants to stay on top of all her to-dos, personal, family, and studies, and she adopts technology in a way that helps her to do so. And there's a new material agency coming out of this. And that could be, for example, technology as a burden, the virtual classroom as a burden that needs to be mastered, managed to get the best results out of it. So besides having to understand the content of a lecture, she now has to understand the content of a lecture and manage all the tools that are required to consume the lecture in the first place. So another constraint, and the implication chain goes on from there. What's important to mention here is this is just one snapshot of the whole chain, and I took 2 human to material implications for each chain, but we could move on. Of course, this entanglement process doesn't stop here at the 3rd change in routines, but it goes on and on and on, and it's a never-ending story. But actually, by the way, if you're more interested into that, you could, for example, read Adaptive Structuration Theory by DeSantis and Poole, who describes this constant entanglement in more detail. Now, what do we learn from this? And that's the first learning that I'd like to give you. And after that, I'd like to develop a couple of hypotheses that we can draw out of this first empirical findings. Now, the first learning, and that's a very important learning, is although we all start at the same page here, we all start at this shift to distance learning, which has been imposed, of course, by governmental regulations. We end up in very different locations just because this implication process looks very different depending on who we are looking at and what human agencies, or we could also say personal goals, this person or persona is following upon. So we can see that Ruth somehow would describe maybe technology as a surrogate, keeping up her everyday business, and which is bypassing the unpleasant crisis, but it's just surrogate, and maybe she would like to get rid of it as soon as possible because she would like to go back to normal. Frank would give another definition for technology. To him, technology is rather a toy, and he likes it. He likes to play with that toy, developing himself further and reinventing himself and his teaching. So it's really about his role as a lecturer and his role in front of the class. That's important here. And finally, there's Samantha, who would describe technology even completely different, because for her, it's in the first place, of course, a relieving factor. She can resume her studies. But at the other hand, it's a additional burden to manage during her studies. And the bullets that I'm giving here, the blue dots, are just the human agency aspects that we covered already when going through this implication chains. So that's just for you to check up on the validity of these preliminary definitions that I give here. Okay, so the further away we go from this central event, the lockdown, the more different all the different stakeholders might think about technology. And that's why it's so difficult to give one solid definition for technology. And that's why the first definition that I gave you was so awkward, because we can just define it if we are looking at the person who is defining technology for him or herself. So wrapping up on the findings, but that's not the end, it's just a preliminary end, is what we can see is groups and individuals adopted digital aids vividly during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is in the first place a good thing. Organizations have massively updated their toolboxes. I think this is true for almost all universities. We bought new licenses, we bought studio equipment, we equipped all our lecturers with necessary cameras and microphones and so on. So there's a lot of things going on the technological side. That's also a good thing, actually, because that allowed us to keep within the borders of the summer term, for example. Now, as a bottom line here, we can say digital aids have definitely contributed to our teaching, and they have helped us to keep education processes quite stable, or almost stable, but at least running, and that was important for us. And what we have also seen is that the necessity to change, which was imposed by COVID-19, has urged lecturers to pursue new teaching avenues. And that was also a good thing, because we as lecturers learned how to act in a completely new field. And that's, in the first place, a good thing. And it also created obsessions. So these necessities have become obsessions here and there. Some lecturers really, like Frank, for example, as a persona, really like to go these new ways. And what we can also see is that the discussion here is very much technology focused. So it's all about having the tools, having the licenses, having the access, having the students in the virtual classrooms. It's a little bit less maybe focused on educational things, didactics and so on. Although to say this is also part of the game, but to me it always seems a little bit technology focused here. And the lessons learned from the last slide, technology is typically only see from the perspective of whatever role I'm currently in. And as we saw, Frank, Ruth, and Samantha developed their own definitions of what technology is and what the role of technology was during this COVID-19 pandemic. And that's a good thing, but this is something that needs to be consolidated. So let me end up with a couple of hypotheses that I'd like to give in this context. The first one is the incorporation of digital aids that came with distance learning in the COVID-19 pandemic will affect teaching in the future. This is something that we saw when we look, or that we see when we look into Ruth's implication chain. Technology and the affordances of technology find their ways into, for example, the unique selling propositions of programs. If we, for example, can tell our students, hey, look, if you come to us studying Kufstein, you will have, I don't know, to travel only 50% of the weekends to Kufstein, and the other 50% can be learned from home. That's a good thing, maybe. And this is why I think that this will not end with the end of COVID-19, but this will accompany us a little bit further, actually. The second hypothesis is the introduction of digital aids, in the example of a virtual classroom, but digital aids in general, demand new capabilities from the lecturers, because by the time they have been developing teaching skills, and those teaching skills were tailored towards the lecture hall setting. And now they need to know how to interact with a camera, how to speak in front of a camera. They need to know about lighting, about streaming technology, cameras, and so on and so on. So there's a lot of things happening here as well. And that's something that we can see if you look into the second part of the implication chain of Frank, for example, where he's improving his digital toolbox over time. What's really an important thing, I think, is that we see that the access to and the use of digital aids has become something which could be described as a strange attractor. The concept of a strange attractor comes from chaos theory. I've put you the McBridge paper from 2005, for example, into the footnote here. Strange attractors give us a feeling of stability, although they are not really stable. So just concentrating on technology and the technical part of technology gives us a feeling of stability in otherwise very chaotic times. But I think we need to go beyond that, of course. That's what we can, for example, see if you look at Frank again and the second part of his implication chain, where he's constantly improving. So he does better lighting in his studio, and then he's improving his microphone, and then he's spending a lot of money on a new camera. But is this really what we aim for? Well, that can be discussed later, of course. What we can also see is the incorporation of digital aids into our teaching needs a lot more time for scaffolding. So as we can see when we look at Samantha's implication chain, she loses track sometimes. The borders between her different routines get blurred, and what she really needs is she needs some help, some additional structures that she can use to go further in her studies, in her learning routines. And there's this final one, which means that we need to discuss digital aids beyond the technical level. I think this is also what I already mentioned when speaking about the strange tractor thing. But as I perceive it today, we talk a lot about technology, about technical details, but we need to go further here and advance. And that's something that we see if we look at where these three personas end after their individual implication chains. We can see we need to spend some time to bring these people together, discuss the role of technology, and discuss where we'd like to be, not where we really are, but where we'd like to be and where we'd like to push things through when COVID-19 has ended. So back to the initial question: did video kill the lecture hall star? The good answer is no, I don't think so. I think there has been a lot of change coming up with the introduction of video and other education technologies in our teaching, but I think it didn't kill us as lecture hall stars, but I think it puts new demands on us as lecturers to develop ourselves, to come up with new capabilities, with new structures, to get the whole thing going. But I think one thing is clear: if you look at the song text of the original Buckle song, there's this one line: "We can't rewind, we've gone too far." I think that this is definitely fitting to the discussion of the role of technology in the COVID-19 pandemic. And with that, I thank you very much.